Get ready to rumble. Shilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Adrian Dignam, a resident of Sydney, Australia, a professional advisor specializing in strategic planning and the commercialism of innovation. And today's topic is COVID and rising tyranny in Australia. Adrian, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thank you, Rob. It's a delight to be with you.
I want to start here because this is fascinating to me. I've never visited Australia. It's been on my bucket list for a long time, but the perspective that many Americans have held until very recently was that Australia was much like America, but just about 50 years behind the curve. In other words, a very desirable place to be. And I wanted to get your take on America's perspective of Australia as Australians see it, and where does the reality lie?
I think we're going through a bit of a, I don't know whether you'd call it an identity crisis in Australia. Some of the things that we thought we were and now we're not sure that we are. Some of the things that we used to be and we no longer are. I think it takes an episode like this for things to be revealed, and I think they're only being revealed in part. I had an experience years ago when I was helping my wife clear out a garage in a refurbished house, and there was a block of lumber in the corner. It was sort of like a 4x3, maybe several feet long. And I went to pick up this piece of hardwood, which was painted white, and I went to pick it up, and it was light as a feather, and I realised that there wasn't much more than the paint surrounding the insides. The rest of it had been eaten away by white ants. And I think we are, in a sense, in Australia, finding out some things about what has been going on under the paintwork. Not that we have a complete view of it at all, but those of us who've been following this for a while have a greater understanding than we had before. And I think both locally and globally, I think we are overawed to the extent of it being incomprehensible, the depth of evil that is being revealed. And I think that's part of the reason why we're really struggling to understand where we are. There's I guess you'd say as a politician, he's one of the new breed who've risen with a minority group to protest the tyranny in Australia. And he published a letter that he written to our Governor-General, who is the senior representative of the Queen in Australia. He said it's only because of the decency of Australians that this has been tolerated as long as it has. It's attractive to think that we would be, in that sense, decent people. And I guess we like to think of ourselves as decent people. And obviously, we've gone through a lot of history in tandem with the US and other countries, and often we've been tied together by war. And I think more and more as we've studied the history of war and the mechanisms behind war, the less we are proud of that particular driver, although we are glad to have been mutually loyal. But in terms of an identity, we, I think, are largely staggered at how quickly we've fallen into compliance. I don't know whether we see ourselves as being markedly different from a lot of other countries, and I wouldn't even separate the so-called Western democracies from other countries in the world. I think we've been staggered by the willingness to comply with government directives. But once you understand what has been done and done in an orchestrated way, and I think anybody that other than Blind Freddy could have seen very early on, if we were half awake spiritually, that this was clearly planned, clearly highly orchestrated, with a lot of actors involved. And it has been a coordinated assault of fear which I think is totally unmatched in world history. And it's well documented that when you assault people with fear, their mental processing shuts down. This is, well-established psychology. The message, the narrative that hit everywhere around the world, and it certainly hit Australia with tremendous force, is that we were faced with a very, very dangerous new bug for which there were no answers until we came up with a solution which was loosely termed a vaccine. So from the beginning, we were told that this was massively threatening. And in the context of that, whether you look at it as Maslow's hierarchy or how you look at it, people were afraid. And in a context of fear, people will allow authoritarian behaviour. And again, that's quite well documented. So I think we would see ourselves as being a bit philosophical. Australians like to use the expression "she'll be right," which means things will turn out all right. We are a big believer in a fair go. We're a big believer in not dobbing your mates in, which means not being a snitch. And now we're discovering that people will quite happily snitch on each other because they're so terrified of this disease, according to the narrative. I have a close relative who works on emergency radio. He works 12-hour shifts answering 000 calls, equivalent to your 911 calls. And he said a substantial majority of the calls that they're now receiving are from people reporting their neighbours for breaches of so-called orders. These things are hard to, I can say that to you in a couple of sentences, but it's hard to describe how we've moved so quickly from a point where you give your neighbour a fair go, you cut people slack, you allow people to be themselves, to a point where people are looking furtively at each other over the tops of masks. You can be challenged if, for example, you pull your mask down below your nostrils. You can be challenged if you're not wearing a mask. You can be challenged if you haven't signed in or used your phone app at the before you go into the store. You can be challenged if you're quote-unquote out of area. It's hard to describe how fast this has moved, but if you do understand how fear will drive people, and if you understand that this was clearly orchestrated, then that explains a lot.
Well, I have so many questions to ask you, Adrian Dignam, and this is just a wonderful opportunity for you to tell us what's going on, because I think a lot of the news we get here is filtered with a perspective. I wanted to talk very specifically about what it is like day to day for you. You mentioned an app. We don't have that yet, at least not here where we are in Central Virginia. But what is the extent of these lockdowns, the curfews, and what is it that you need to do in order to just conduct daily business?
There are a bunch of dimensions there to explore. The app was actually introduced, as I recall, prior to COVID, but basically it just was a way of identifying where you were, and they made a big point of how it wasn't. No, it may have been in the very early stages of COVID, but the government made a point of saying this is not mandatory. But it was an app that was freely available for download onto your mobile phone, and you were thereby able to identify that you were in a particular position and place and not in another particular place. Of course, all of this information is being trapped anyway. If you're, on Google Maps or whatever on your mobile phones, the information is there anyway. But this was a more specific, supposedly customer or operated initiative. There was a lot of pressure to download it, incessant advertising. There was a massive adverse reaction from the community at large, and after a while the government basically backed off pushing that app. That app and it was really about connecting identity to location, those two parameters. It's quite different from a vaccination passport, which is something which is, again, being heralded and pushed, but it hasn't quite become part of life yet. When it comes to orders, they vary. I could say they vary by the day. I went so-called out of area about a month ago to help a relative on a building site, and I checked the prevailing mandate as to how far you could travel and what the conditions were. And I went up there and I came back, and about a week later, we were sitting in the lounge room watching a Christian program, and a police car drove in the driveway. Oh. Sandra and I had time to pray briefly and for me to just calm her nerves. And then we went outside, and the long and the short is that our registration presumably been reported, and the police just inquired as to whether I knew anything about anybody that might have been up at this site. And I was quite philosophical, and I said, yes, I've been. And they said, were you aware that you weren't allowed to? And I said, no, I'm not aware of that at all. I actually have a copy of the standing orders in my car that I'd been printed off in anticipation that I might be stopped. So I fished them out, and then they said, oh, yeah, but those are out of date now. That was 10 days ago. And I said, well, those were current at the time. And the policeman said, yes, but they would have changed maybe 10 times since then. And I said to him, well, there's a principle in law that there's a point at which you can't be expected to keep up with the level of detail of a number of changes. And the policeman said, oh, yes, we know that most of these things wouldn't stand up under the law. Now, that's an important concept to understand, because right across Australia, even this morning I was reading about a senior sergeant in the Victorian Police who's resigned, and she says a significant majority of the police in the Victorian Police Service are very, very unhappy about the way that the bureaucracy has been using them against the community. In terms of the physicality of the interactions between the police and the community, it's been most brutal in Victoria and in Melbourne. The level of coercion in regional towns in New South Wales, in our state, where the Indigenous communities are quite sometimes a substantial majority. I've seen very ugly footage of police accompanied by soldiers basically saying to Indigenous families that their benefits would be removed if they didn't submit to the vaccinations, these sorts of things. Our Australian Federal Constitution, Commonwealth Constitution, has a specific provision which doesn't allow these sorts of intrusions, medical or dental intrusions, without free consent. And the High Court has found that you are not allowed to achieve by coercion what you cannot achieve directly. But these things are being ignored flagrantly, and the protests are gradually working their way through the court system. But if I can say to you that, 2 weeks after we had a visit from a couple of police because of my being supposedly out of area, my wife had a police car pull her over. They sat behind her for 5 minutes, and she didn't know whether to drive away or to get out of the car, neither of which was likely to help the situation. So she waited, and eventually they came over and they said, oh, we're just checking you for a breath test.
Wow.
Well, it was obvious that they were intimidating her, and they weren't doing a breath test. I have another close relative she lives in a beachside suburb. She went to the aid of a young lady who was being set upon, basically being not physically manhandled, but surrounded by 4 policemen. And my friend went to the aid of this girl and started photographing the proceedings. And next thing, 4 separate policemen surrounded her. They've harassed her. They've since charged her with 5 offences. And as recently as last week, they followed her into a doctor's surgery, challenged her over whether she'd registered her presence, challenged her for why she wasn't wearing a mask, even though she has a medical exemption. These sorts of things are incessant, and they vary by the day. So we have a sort of a freedom day, because some of the interregional travel that has been prohibited has now been loosened up, and you're now allowed to gather in bigger groups rather than not at all. You're allowed to go walking in groups of 5 if you've been double vaccinated, but only in groups of 2 if you haven't. There's a lot, and it's constant, and it keeps changing, and it's not consistent from state to state.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast will continue with Adrian Dignam, live from Australia, in just a moment.
Online at shillingshow.com.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration, nationalism, and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories, and in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. Border Hawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast, and we continue with our guest from Australia, Adrian Dignam. There's something very instructive for Americans in all that you're saying here, and that is a lot of people believe it couldn't happen here. And of course, we've already seen at least the beginnings of it. But for people who ask you, what has happened to these police officers? I would imagine that just a couple of years ago, no one would have thought this was possible, that the police would never turn on the people like this. What do you attribute that to?
I guess one of the lessons we learn in life is that every individual is different. So I need to be careful of sweeping statements. I have relatives who work in the police service. There are good and bad police, but in general, I grew up as a little kid having the local constable talk to us about, if you're worried or you need help, go to a policeman. That was your first port of call. That has shifted quite dramatically. If you understand some of the systems, some are cultural, some are secretive. These clearly affect the authority structure. And in a command and control environment, if you break the rules, you get kicked out. And that's what happened to this senior sergeant in Melbourne. And you may be colliding with secret allegiances with handshakes and all the rest of it, which are not apparent, even though the police service and the military are legendary for their involvement in these sorts of undeclared loyalties.
I'd like to also speak about the church and the role of the church in Australia, how the church has responded or capitulated to the situation you're facing.
Many of the people that I am with, and we would like to think that we are the red-pilled ones and the others are the blue-pilled ones, that we are the ones who understand a little bit more about what's going on. I could say I'm disgusted, I'm appalled, I'm very, very disappointed at the willingness of the majority of Christians and of Christian leaders to align with the prevailing narrative. I am by original training a scientist, and it was very obvious to me very, very early on that we were being sold a snow story. It was very, very obvious. And I challenge anybody who does serious homework to form any other conclusion because it fails on so many dimensions. But I think that the same fear and orchestrated repetitive narrative, it's hard to describe, Rob, what it's like when almost every ad break on a TV channel has a COVID ad or a vaccine ad on it. That's how intense it is. It's absolutely intense. And when this story first broke, we even noticed that the colour schemes for the news readers, one channel had all red and black. Red and black. How's that for a happy picture for a morning news program? Just fear and a constant ingrained narrative to the point where I think it's just sucked in the average church leader as well as the average Christian. And people are still praying as if this is a plague, and some of them are even wondering whether God has sent it in judgment. The absolute ignorance about what's really going on is just, to me, absolutely staggering.
What are the differences that you're seeing in Australia, Adrian Dignam, regarding rural or suburban versus big city? Because a lot of people would see these videos and assume that this is the same level of intensity across your country.
Australia is very urbanised, very, very urbanised. It's one of the most highly urbanised countries in the world, certainly for its population. My understanding is that it's less intense generally in the regional areas. Even as I say that, I mentioned the Indigenous communities in regional, certainly in regional New South Wales, who've been experiencing an onslaught. And I believe it's part of the grand scheme to actually continue to drive people into the cities. And I think North America is blessed that they have a far more regionalised demography. I don't have a real feel, I guess, for the differences. I think it's pretty sad that we're in a situation where when people even gather in public to protest, under the pretext of this terrible supposed COVID disease, people are not allowed to gather in groups, so the system deliberately frustrates sharing of an alternative point of view. It's totally not tolerated in the media, as you would appreciate. It's not tolerated face-to-face, and so the opportunity to get together in small groups has been frustrated, whether it's for dinner or in church or anything else. So from that point of view, the ability to carry an alternative story and to proclaim the truth, or even to declare an alternative, is not only frustrated, but also it translates into incitement. And one young lady that I think I mentioned to you previously in Victoria was arrested, not for doing anything physical, but simply for encouraging people to assemble to protest the tyranny. She ended up having, I think, 3 weeks in jail.
Is there a rise of political heroes? I'm sure you've seen a lot of villainy, but what about people who have stood up? And you mentioned one person earlier, but are there more of them who are standing up and helping to lead this movement back towards a rational and freedom approach?
Absolutely. There are individual politicians, mainly from minority parties. There are a couple of standout people who've actually, one has recently broken away from a long-standing major party and has in fact become the leader of a political party of whom the chairman was a former federal representative. It's ironical, so that guy is Clive Palmer. He was in federal parliament, and the state guy, Craig Kelly, actually left the Liberal Party, which is the current party in government in both New South Wales and Australia, and has become the leader of the United Australia Party, of which Clive Palmer is the chairman. There are also heroes amongst the Christian community, probably particular individuals, because they're not in the dozens, but certainly a handful of people in each of the states are rising up. And it is, I think, demonstrating that we have loyalties to God and to Caesar. The mainstream churches seem to be very happy to give all of our priorities to treating the elected government with respect and not even voicing a protest. But frankly, if they voiced a protest, it would be largely ignorant, because I think they believe the reigning paradigm.
I'd like to take a look forward here, finally, Adrian. Where do you think this is all heading? Is there any resolution in sight, or is this the future of Australia and obviously many other parts of the world?
Yeah, I've watched a couple of your interviews before tonight, Rob, and you are superb in the way you manage them, and you've got some great questions. I'm struggling to work out what to say in the few minutes that we have available. Depending on what your theology is, I believe that God has, we are in Christ, and everywhere that we put our foot, he's given into our hands, and we are there to be more than conquerors in this life. We're not to be fatalists. We're not to expect that God is going to whip us out of what's coming, however tough that might be, but rather to be salt and light in the world in which we are. So that gives you a hint about where my theology stands. And in a sense, I think that is appropriate regardless of what your theology is. There is a strong and growing groundswell in Australia, but interestingly enough, it's mainly over freedom of choice about vaccines. I think that's sad, because the discussion is far too downstream. The Supreme Court has recently gone through some cases, and those cases, the judgment has been reserved, but those cases relate to whether the mandates comply with the laws, state and federal, and they almost certainly do not. And so if the judge comes back and says that they're not lawful orders, then the politicians could change the laws, and therefore the orders would become lawful. So the upstream narrative itself needs to be challenged. There are some pretty ugly scenarios about what's going on in terms of, supposedly the global reset.
Yes.
Many of us certainly have our eyes on the recounts going on in Arizona and elsewhere. We wonder whether the posse will ride back into town, and if it does, whether that will have a cascade effect in Australia, which we hope it would do. But it's a big question.
Adrian Dignam, it's been a wonderful time talking with you today, and I thank you so much for joining us here on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast so that you could tell the truth about what's going on. And as people look forward here, is there anything that we in America can be doing to help you in Australia?
I don't think we've ever been more conscious of the need for prayer. I don't think we've ever, Sarah and I have never prayed like we've prayed since this has escalated. There's no question that's opened up extraordinary opportunities to share the gospel with people. Every day I pray for more and more whistleblowers, because whistleblowers are stepping past the fear and sacrificially bringing truth to light, and that's what will change the reigning narrative. The weight of the truth will ultimately break through, and those are some of the things that I look for. I think I see value in prayer right now that I don't think I've ever seen it like this before, and we're seeing it manifest in power day after day after day. So
that's what we'll do. Adrian Dignam, thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thank you, Rob.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.